Another video in my series on why Jewish apologetics are so bad. This is Rabbi Daniel Rowe, a new face to me. Anyway, he's talking about who really wrote the Bible. Let's listen.
We're going to be looking at a documentary based on a best-selling book called The Bible Unearthed and exploring the field of biblical archaeology. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rabbi Reacts. In our Archaeology in the Bible series, we have been focused for several weeks on analyzing the documentary The Bible Unearthed. And at the end of the last session, I said that we're going to now look at the radical claim, is there grounds and reason to even think this is a divine text? I'm talking from a rational basis, not just a traditional basis, and emotional, spiritual connection, which are all legitimate too. But I'm talking about the text itself. Now, I want to dive in, but with a little introduction. Over the past few episodes, and I hope you've seen them. If you haven't yet, you can see them in the text below. But we've been discussing the dating, amongst other things, of the biblical text. When we say dating of the Bible, I'm referring specifically to the 5 books of Moses, in Judaism known as from Bereshit to Devarim, or from Genesis to Deuteronomy. That's what we've been looking at. The claim that's divine authorship, and we've been looking at dating it and different claims archaeologically. Is it Chezkiyahu, Hezekiah? Is it Josiah, Yoshiyahu? Is it Ezra? Who, where, what area, and so on. And we've been actually noticing problems with all the late dating hypotheses and more reasons to believe that it is actually really ancient, talking 10th century, 11th, 12th, 13th, some very far back in time.
Well, I've only watched one of your other episodes, so I can't really comment on anything you said before. I'll just state my own view, then, that some oral mythologies probably do go very far back in time, but there was no written Torah until around the Babylonian exile, so I think my views are largely going to be different from your views. So go on, let's hear yours.
And that has a critical implication because the text is primarily narrative and law. In fact, the story of how the Israelite people came to be and how they got their divine law. But then there's also quite a few areas towards the end of the book of Leviticus and all the way through Deuteronomy, chapter 4, and then later on chapter 26 and so on, that start projecting into the future. Now, in the beginning, Moses is giving warnings to the people saying, if you do well, there'll be blessing. If you do badly, there'll be curses. And here are all the sorts of curses. But as especially Deuteronomy goes on, the vision is more and more saying, actually, I know this is going to happen. You're going to be exiled from your land. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to have terrible things happen. But don't worry, God won't abandon you and so on. Now, these prophecies or projections into the future are very important because there's anyone can make prophecies or projections into the future. You could predict turmoil in the Middle East in the coming decade, and you'll pretty much hit the nail on the head. But there's also things you can't predict easily. So I'll give you an example. The biblical text predicts that amongst the calamities that will befall Israel are lots of famines and illnesses and epidemics and plagues and so on. That is true, and we can see that it all came true, but it's not very big proof of divine authorship or human authorship because any human can write that in. It's a sort of thing that happens to people every so often. Plagues hit, epidemics hit, famines hit in a land like Israel in the ancient world. There could be plenty of years where the crop yields were smaller. And so that kind of stuff is easy to predict and doesn't really demonstrate very much. You could predict victory in wars and failures in wars. Those things happen to all sorts of nations too. So those kind of things, you're always going to have motivational speech. We're going to win the next war. Oh, what an amazing prophecy. It came true. But that stuff is not really impressive. But when the biblical text starts talking about exile, now exile really is an issue because the vast majority of nations have never been exiled from their homeland. They get conquered and assimilated into the dominant culture. They get persecuted or just absorbed, and their culture ends, their language ends, their religion ends, and they become absorbed in the dominant one. And that's how most nations come to an end. Very few nations in history, or relatively few nations in history, get exiled. But pretty much every nation that does get exiled ends. The Assyrians did a lot of exiling, and the peoples they exiled pretty much finish off as nations once they're moved out of the land, end up somewhere else. Their land, their language, their culture, it all starts to disappear. The Han Chinese did the same. Incas in Southern America did the same. So if you're a human author of the Bible, this constant emphasis on the fact that Israel's going to exile is incredibly difficult to predict if you're sitting very far back in time, because most nations won't be exiled. B is, if they are going to be exiled, if that's kind of warning you're trying to throw out to the people, and every terrible thing's going to happen, then amongst other things you're going to be exiled and finished as a nation. because that's what happens to exiled people. And you can imagine that as a good warning. You guys are going to get exiled. I mean, it's terrible. If you ever let go of this law, you're going to be exiled and finished as a people, and God will choose somebody else. But the Bible doesn't say that. The Torah, when I say the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, they don't say that. They're constantly this theme of you're going to be in exile. It's going to be a horrible exile. You're going to be scattered across the 4 corners of the globe. And, well, they wouldn't use globes. Arets, the 4 corners of the world. And God will bring you back.
Okay, and virtually all these verses refer to the Babylonian exile, written around the time of the Babylonian exile.
Now, there are 2 good explanations for this. One is that we're not dealing with a human author. We're dealing with somebody who can predict the crazy impossibility of weird things in history happening and make sure they happen.
Nope, that is an explanation, but certainly not a good explanation. We have no evidence for the existence of such a non-human entity, let alone its ability to author texts. If your car doesn't start in the morning, you could say there are 2 explanations: a battery issue or a demon who is haunting the car. Those are both explanations, but only one of them is a good explanation. And if the battery explanation is shown inadequate, then there would be another good explanation. The alternator is shot, or the ignition module is bad, or a rodent chewed through a wire. And if those explanations fail, there would be another good explanation. The gas went stale. And after you run through 100 of those explanations, the next explanation would be you didn't start the car the right way, or maybe you did start it, but you thought that it didn't start. Maybe you didn't even go into the car. Maybe you don't even have a car, and maybe you have early onset dementia. Maybe someone planted a remote shutoff. Maybe some prankster swapped your car out for an identical replacement with no engine. The point is, the demon explanation does not become a good explanation until you have exhausted virtually every other single naturalistic possibility, however remote. Any of those naturalistic explanations, however unlikely, will be more likely than that it's the action of a being that violates natural laws and is not known to exist and cannot exist. So, the explanation of non-human authorship of the Bible is not a good explanation. That explanation will be at the very bottom of a very long list of possible explanations and will not become a good explanation until every single naturalistic possibility has been exhausted, however remote, however unlikely. Let me put this in a way that might be easier for you and other Orthodox Jews to understand. You know, of course, that Christians believe that the Sunday after Jesus was crucified, his tomb was discovered to be empty. They believe he was resurrected and went on to appear to various people in his resurrected form. Now, Christian apologists are well aware that there could be other explanations for the fact of the empty tomb. Maybe Jesus wasn't really dead. Maybe grave robbers took the body. This possibility was already raised in the Gospel of Matthew. Maybe Jesus' body wasn't in that tomb to begin with. Maybe there was no tomb and the whole thing is a fiction. Maybe his disciples had grief-induced hallucinations. And if you watch Christian apologetics, as I sometimes do, you will know that they have responses and objections to all these possible explanations and many more. And their objections always aim to make these scenarios seem highly unlikely. For example, consider the grave robbery scenario. Apologists will say that this would have required many people incredible coordination, been impossible to keep secret, been extremely risky, had no motive, would not have left the burial cloths behind, would have been seen by the Roman guards, and so on and so on and so on. The point is to make the likelihood of such a situation seem extremely remote. And maybe it is. And maybe the likelihood of all the other naturalistic explanations can also be made to seem extremely remote. But as a person who has no prior commitment to Christian mythologies, I think you can appreciate that one of these naturalistic explanations, however remote, is still infinitely more likely than that a dead person came back to life. That violates natural laws and has never been observed to happen. So that explanation is way far down the list after every outrageous but naturalistic explanation has been fully and completely disproved. and those naturalistic explanations must be fully disproved. The slightest sliver of possibility will give a naturalistic explanation greater likelihood than an explanation which is impossible. I think you would agree with this. And I think it's worthwhile to keep this example in mind. Unlikely naturalistic explanations are infinitely more likely than supernatural explanations.
Number two is a much easier human explanation, is it was all written after the first exile.
Around the first exile, I would say. Some before, some during, some after.
You see, they'd already gone into exile. Okay, that maybe not scattered four corners, but they'd been exiled, there'd been some persecution, and they come back to the land. So the author of the end of Leviticus, the author of large chunks of Deuteronomy is post-exilic, or some post-exilic editor sat there and added all these pieces in.
Super! You have a good naturalistic explanation. Now, whatever problems you find with this explanation that make it seem somewhat difficult to swallow, it's always going to be better than a supernatural explanation. So, are we done here?
And this constant reference to going into exile. Because the alternative, if you're looking at somebody writing 8th century, 10th century BCE, 11th century, 12th century BCE, is you're looking at somebody who somehow got the wildest prediction right. Now, before we get into this, could it be post-exilic? Let me just tell you how right they got it. It's not like Israel a bit got exiled. Like I say, most nations in history didn't get exiled. In fact, only a tiny minority did, but those who did stopped existing. But Jewish people, that's the Israelites and their descendants, have been exiled and exiled and exiled. And when those verses in the Bible tell us they're going to be scattered across the world, that has really come true with Israel.
Well, all the prophecies of the exile in the Torah relate to the Babylonian exile. It's actually pretty clear by comparing the language to Jeremiah and Lamentations, which are definitely associated with the Babylonian exile. So, I don't know about all the exiles you have in mind. I only know of 3 that could possibly be relevant, the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Roman is way late to be of interest here.
In fact, Israel has been so exiled, we've been exiled twice from the land of Israel itself. And since, let's say, in the time between when we got finally kicked out of the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, till the return of Jewish people to the land in the late 19th, early 20th century, in 1948 establishment of the State of Israel, Jews were exiled, I believe the number is 81 times.
Well, sucks for us, but the Torah is only talking about the Babylonian exile, so let's stick with that.
Not including expulsion from Arab lands in the 1950s after the State of Israel. That's an exile roughly every 20 years. I mean, that's every 21, 22, 23 years. So there's lots and lots of exile. In other words, these prophecies are coming incredibly true.
Which prophecies? You going to cite some verses? They are all about the Babylonian exile.
With Israel. The prophecies of persecution, right? They are going to be hated and so faint-hearted, that leaves will rustle. All those kind of verses come incredibly true with the Jewish people.
And they are all talking about the Babylonian exile and were all written at that time. What are you trying to show?
Even when the verse in Torah says you'll be lemashal or leshnina, which means you'll basically become the analogy and the vocabulary that's used for hatred, it comes incredibly true, right?
Right. It's literally from Jeremiah. It was written about the Babylonian exile at that time.
The vocabulary, the dictionary of hatred is full of words that started with the persecution of this tiny little group of people, the Jews, whether it's the word pogrom or whether it's the word ghetto or genocide, all these things, the words that were originally used about persecution of the Jew that have been universalized to all of hatred. So these prophecies in this book are just incredibly true.
Well, I wouldn't say they're incredibly true. I mean, many descriptions seem like poetic hyperbole, but they certainly describe aspects of the Babylonian exile or how Jeremiah and other contemporaries regarded the destruction and exile.
The idea that you're going to be small in number. One example of this is Deuteronomy chapter 4. Let's just take, for example, around verse 27. So it says that Hashem will scatter you amongst all the peoples.
Okay, Jeremiah says almost the same thing with almost the same words. It's the Babylonian exile.
You'll be left few in number where the nations where God will lead you, right? And there you'll assimilate into their gods and so on, and before you seek God and come back. So, a very, very strong, another strong example is in Deuteronomy chapter 28, where they have a lot of stuff. And there we talk about the fact that once you're exiled amongst those nations, right? Let's take verse 65, for example, right? You won't be tranquil. There'll be no rest for the sole of your foot. Hashem will give you trembling heart and longing of eyes and suffering of your soul. Your life will hang in the balance. You'll be frightened night and day. You'll not be sure of your livelihood. In the morning, you'll say, if only it could be the night. In the night, you'll say, if only it could be the morning. This is the type of scenario you'll have.
Right, and it's the type of scenarios exactly presented in Lamentations and Jeremiah. Lamentations 1:3, she settled among the nations but found no rest. Jeremiah 35, terror without peace.
And there's so many verses describing this type of thing.
Yes, there are so many verses describing the Babylonian exile. It was a big deal to these writers.
So let's take a look at all of this and just see how true it is. And the fact, for example, as I quote Vinashatim, the same spot, you'll be tiny in number, whereas you should have been as big as the stars of the heavens. Now, when we go into exile in the Second Temple period, the Jewish people are not a small number. I mean, exactly what the number is, historians debate, but we're talking millions of people. And we're talking, I don't know, 5% to 10% of the Roman Empire, possibly. 10% is probably exaggeration, but it's certainly a not insignificant number. Or put it slightly differently, if there's 4 million Jews around that time.
But we're not interested in that time because all the prophecies in the Pentateuch relate to the Babylonian exile, which was around 600 BC. So can we skip to demonstrating who wrote the Torah?
That's not very different to what Han China was at a pretty similar point in time. So that China's grown into a population of 1.2 billion people, or and ancient Israel has, the Bible says, you'll be small when you go into exile. So instead of becoming 1.2 billion people, we bobbled along the bottom of the statistical graph.
Okay, Jeremiah 23:3, I will gather the remnant of my flock. But what is the point? This is all Babylonian exile.
Hitting a peak of, I think, 18 million people before World War II, 12 million afterwards. Today there's 14 million, 15 million Jews in the world. Right? It's a minuscule fraction of humanity, not even 1%, not even a tenth of 1%. I mean, it's just nothing, right? Statistically speaking. So these prophecies are coming true again and again and again in very radical and very, very clear ways.
Well, you can say they came true regarding the Babylonian exile because that's what they were written about. If you say they are coming true again and again and again, then you are effectively saying that they are vague enough to describe an incredibly wide variety of situations, then that makes them pretty useless as prophecies. If I said I made a remarkable prediction that Aaron Judge would hit a home run in the first inning of a game, and my prediction came true, and then it came true again, and then it came true again, and again, and again, and again, over many years, you're going to think that must have been a pretty vague and worthless prediction. But anyway, are we going to get to analyzing who wrote the Torah?
Could it be post-exilic? That would be the way to explain it as human authorship. I know the humans came back from the exile, wrote these texts or added to them, embellished, added these chapters and sections in, and to show the people, look, the ancient divine prophecy came true, the ancient divine promise came true.
Yes, that is almost certainly what happened. That is a good explanation, and for whatever flaws it may have, it will still rank infinitely higher than an explanation that invokes imaginary beings.
But the problem with that, as we looked in our past few videos, is any text written post-exilic would have to have mentioned Jerusalem.
No, it wouldn't.
Because you're coming back to try to rebuild Jerusalem, try to rebuild the temple. And if you're editing and playing with these texts, the shocking thing about the 5 books of Moses
is that anyone believes these things?
Is this, as we point out in previous videos, that the word Jerusalem is the most mentioned city in the Bible. By the Bible, I mean all of the Old Testament. It's the most mentioned word. It's in every single book, even those that are not talking about history or narrative. It's the book of Esther, the book of Song of Songs. It's in all of them, the word Jerusalem.
But it's certainly not a significant place in all of them.
It's the most mentioned city hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, but not in the 5 books of Moses.
Because the setting for that work is before Jerusalem became a significant place and before the Israelites entered Canaan. And the patriarchal narratives that do take place in Canaan are probably quite old and predate any centralization.
They don't mention the word Jerusalem once. And the reason is very simple. To any later author, if you're Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, Josiah, or post-exilic author, Ezra, Nehemiah, whoever you may be, you have to have Jerusalem in because it's the center of your life.
No, you don't have to have Jerusalem. Firstly, if this was being written or redacted during the exile, Jerusalem is very much not the center of your life anymore. You just went through the apocalypse and Jerusalem is gone. Or perhaps you are the child of a refugee and never saw Jerusalem yourself, just the psychological devastation it left on your parents. Who at that time even knew if Jerusalem would ever again be under Israelite control? Jewish leaders wouldn't want their exile religion to be contingent on sacrificing at a place with no temple that they couldn't even get to. The exile religion is going to be one where you can find God from where you are, as Deuteronomy 4 puts it. At this point, Jerusalem is a liability that you're better off without. Secondly, Exodus through Deuteronomy are all set in the wilderness period when Jerusalem was not a place of any notability. I think this is very important. If there was an existing mythology of how Jerusalem became important in the time of David and because of David, you would not want to undercut that mythology by making Moses announce the significance of Jerusalem. That could render a lot of existing mythology incomprehensible. For example, the complete unawareness of Jerusalem's significance on the part of the conquering Israelites and subsequent generations. If the association of Jerusalem with David is a matter of core ideology, which it seems to be in the Book of Kings, you would want to anticipate the selection of that important site without challenging the revelation of that site in existing mythology. And that's exactly what we see in Deuteronomy. But let's be honest here, Rabbi. You can offer literally any naturalistic explanation for the omission of Jerusalem from the Pentateuch, and it would still be an infinitely better explanation than something supernatural. Remember the example of Jesus' empty tomb. So let's give it a try. How about this? An Israelite scribe tragically lost his family during the destruction of Jerusalem. He never wants to hear the name of that city again, and he removes it from all of the texts that he copies. It turns out he's one of the few remaining scribes who escaped the destruction, and on account of his great skill and knowledge, his work becomes the new standard. And this is why Jerusalem is not mentioned in our Pentateuch. Well, let's try another one. Upon returning to the land of Israel after Cyrus's pronouncement that ended the exile, the city of Jerusalem lies with broken walls and is indefensible. As scribes are putting together the Israelite mythology into written form, they realize that declaring Jerusalem as a cultic and political center will paint a huge target on it for any belligerent powers, and it would be better to mask its significance. They therefore studiously avoid mentioning the city, and this is why Jerusalem is not mentioned in our Pentateuch. Well, let's try another one. Imagine that there were a group of Judeans who resented Josiah's efforts to abolish their local shrines. In the chaos of the exile, they see the opportunity to reverse this unwanted reform, and they replace Jerusalem in Josiah's Deuteronomy text with "at any place that I choose," similar to Exodus 20:21, and write additional texts that endorse local worship, such as Moses and Joshua building altars in ad hoc locations, just as indicated by Exodus 20:21. After the Second Temple becomes functional, however, these passages are deemed to undermine the authority of the temple, but are already too well known by this point to be removed. Scribes at the temple therefore remove 2 letters to yield "the place where God will choose," a small enough change to slip by unnoticed in a largely illiterate culture. And this is why Jerusalem is not mentioned in our Pentateuch. So, there you have 5 naturalistic explanations, some much better than others. But they are all naturalistic, involve only phenomena that are unremarkable and have been observed many thousands of times in human culture. Control, politics, fear, trauma, resentment, diversion, deceit, and so on. Any of these explanations is therefore infinitely better than a supernatural explanation that involves suspension of natural laws by a non-human being, neither of which has ever been documented anywhere in the entire human experience. So, having said that, go on now and tell me why the absence of Jerusalem means the Torah could not have been written by someone in 600 BC.
So God is going to make Abraham walk past Jerusalem, not Mount Moriah. If it was Mount Moriah, just say in Jerusalem, right? When he meets Melchizedek, king of Salem, just call it Jerusalem, right?
Sure, but for any of the reasons I gave, that's not what we got.
If you got Shechem and you got Hebron, you got all these important towns, you're going to have people moving through Jerusalem because you're going to want to always make sure that God always knew this was the important city.
No, you absolutely would not want to do that if it would expose your work as a fraud. Everyone knows this iconic shot from 1968's Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston, aka Moses. Why didn't the filmmakers just show that shot at the beginning of the movie? Don't they want everyone to know that this is taking place in New York City? Isn't that really important? Well, absolutely it's important, but it's just as important when this information is revealed. If the movie starts with this shot, you have an entirely different movie. Likewise, if the authors of the Bible had Moses declare Jerusalem as God's chosen city 400 years before David, you would have an entirely different movie. This would undercut all of the narratives from Joshua through Samuel where nobody knows about Jerusalem and undercut all of the subsequent narratives where Jerusalem and David are inseparably joined. If that mythology is important to you as a scribe or a priest, and you believe that mythology, you are not going to blow it up.
You want to tell the people at the time, come on guys, this is our important city. How do you manage to write 5 books without it? It's no later author would have missed the opportunity.
Well, no later author was retrojecting books back into a period before David made Jerusalem a special place, but it's irrelevant.
To write Jerusalem, it's impossible, which is why no later author ever does miss the opportunity to write Jerusalem.
Because they are writing in a different time period with different concerns, but again, it's irrelevant. Is this your whole proof that God wrote the Bible? I hope not.
All the texts from the 10th century onwards, all of them are full of Jerusalem.
Which texts would those be? Are they set in the wilderness era? I don't think so. In the books of Joshua and Judges and 1 Samuel, the works that cover the period before David made Jerusalem a special place, Jerusalem has no special significance in the narrative. It may be mentioned, but just like any other place might be mentioned. So let's do something here to test your hypothesis that authors with knowledge of the temple and Jerusalem would not be able to resist sprinkling this information all over their compositions. Consider 3 scenarios about when these 3 books, Joshua and Judges and 1 Samuel, which have no special mention of Jerusalem, when these books could have been written. First scenario, and most likely, these works, Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel, were written sometime around the exile, certainly by people for whom Jerusalem was known as the site of the temple. Nevertheless, they tell these stories as if they are unaware of this, just like they tell these stories as if they don't know that David will be king. If the authors didn't withhold their knowledge from readers in this way, and from the characters in the story, it would undercut the David narratives and ruin the story. So if scenario 1 is true, we see that good authors around the time of the exile were quite capable of withholding information to serve the story. And that's exactly what they did when retrojecting works like Deuteronomy or Exodus back to the time of Moses. For the second scenario, let's say you imagine these works that have no special recognition of Jerusalem, by which I mean Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel, let's say they were written hundreds of years earlier around the time of King David. In this scenario, the authors of course knew about David and the centrality of Jerusalem, if not yet the temple, but again chose to write the narratives in these books without betraying this knowledge. In scenario 2, we again see that good authors can withhold information to serve the story. Scenario 3. Imagine that Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel, again, the books that don't mention Jerusalem in any special way, were written contemporaneous with the events they describe, or if not written, that these stories were composed and enter oral history. Of course, in this scenario, they don't mention Jerusalem as a holy city or David as king because those things haven't happened yet. But now we have a set of texts, or an oral mythology, that any later works presumably have to play along with, at least to some extent. If a later author is writing about a time prior to Joshua, they cannot mention David or Jerusalem because that contradicts the lack of knowledge of that person and that place in the existing mythology. If they did that, for example, by having Moses mention Jerusalem, readers would say, How come Joshua didn't know that Jerusalem was a special place if Moses already told everyone? For anything to work well with the existing mythology, it has to adapt the reference frame of the existing mythology, and even ancient authors were good enough to do that up until a point. So if scenario 1 or 2 is true, and Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel were written during or after David's time, we have evidence that ancient authors were, in fact, quite able to stifle themselves from injecting their contemporary knowledge into works about earlier periods. And in scenario 3, where these works were written before David, then later authors have to work within an existing mythology that constrains what they can write. If they write something that completely undermines the existing mythology, they expose themselves as frauds. So, I don't know why you seem to think that ancient authors didn't have control of their craft and didn't have the ability to work within a frame of reference. It seems like they did.
But not the 5 books of Moses, which seems to be a clear indication they're written before the 10th century BC.
Nope. It's just an indication that the authors were working within a frame of reference.
Any later author, any post-exilic author would not have allowed a text that spends chapter after chapter of how you weave the threads of Mishkan, of this temporary portable tabernacle, unless they were living in a time where that was there. But if they were taking earlier texts from then and then trying to tell everyone to build a fixed house of God, of course they're going to mention somewhere God saying to Moses, one day I want you to build a fixed home in Jerusalem. It's so easy to throw into the...
Nope, because that breaks the Davidic narratives, and these authors are very careful not to do that. The connection between David and Jerusalem is a core ideology for many of these authors. They are working in the court of a king in the Davidic line, and they are not going to threaten that connection between Jerusalem and the Davidic legend.
You can throw a text about exile and persecution and coming back to the land and all that stuff. You can also throw in and build my home in Jerusalem.
Not without breaking the Davidic narratives, but sure, the Bible could have said a lot of different things and been altered in a lot of different ways at a lot of different times. For example, to remove references to Jerusalem. And any of these scenarios is infinitely more likely than supernatural interventions in the text. There are 10,000 ways that the text could have gotten to where it is now, and any of those is more likely than supernatural interventions. You can go even much further down the list and still have explanations that are infinitely more likely than supernatural intervention. How about this explanation? The Torah was written in the Middle Ages. Oh, but we have the Dead Sea Scrolls from before the Common Era? Well, those could be forgeries. The carbon dating on those scrolls could have been falsified. The academics who certified their provenance could have been bribed or threatened. It could have all been fabricated by the Israeli government to solidify Jewish claims to the land of Israel. Is this a conspiracy theory? Yes, absolutely this is a conspiracy theory. But while it's improbable compared to the other ideas I've suggested, nothing about it violates any natural laws. And all these types of things have happened before in human experience. There have been many forgeries in human art and culture, some incredibly successful, probably some that have still never been detected and never will be. This stuff can happen and has happened and will happen. So conspiracy theories like these, and there are hundreds of them that you could imagine, are also infinitely more likely than the explanation that a supernatural being wrote these documents. But here, let me ask you this. The absence of Jerusalem from the Pentateuch is clearly a very big deal for you. So, I'm curious, on the view that you want to advance that a supernatural deity wrote the Bible, why doesn't the Bible mention Jerusalem? Why didn't Yahweh say the things that you think the Torah should have said?
So God is going to make Abraham walk past Jerusalem, not Mount Moriah. Because Mount Moriah, just say in Jerusalem, right? When he meets Melchizedek, king of Salem, just call it Jerusalem, right? If you got Shechem and you got Hebron, you got all these important towns, you're going to have people moving through Jerusalem because you're going to want to always make sure that God always knew this was the important city.
You are, of course, envisioning an omniscient deity who knows all about Jerusalem being the future holy city and about David being the future king who brings it to prominence. God couldn't possibly be ignorant about these things and yet be able to predict all the exiles you were talking about before. So, since God knows all this stuff, why doesn't God just blurt it straight out in Moses' book? It's far more important than, say, the number of trees at some random place in the desert. So why the big secret? Does God suppress this information because it would spoil the story? Because it would alter the story if this information was known at that early time? Well, whatever reason you can think of for God to withhold this critical information about his chosen site and chosen king, a human author in 600 BC or later could have thought of the same reason. You think these authors were so much less clever than you? I don't think so. And if you say, well, I don't know God's reason for suppressing that information, then just say the same thing about your human author in 600 BC. I don't know his reason for suppressing that information. And that gives you the very same explanation without any supernatural entities or violations of natural laws, and is therefore an infinitely better explanation. So just say a group of authors at around the time of the Babylonian exile compiled the Torah and omitted any mention of Jerusalem, and we don't know exactly why. That's totally fine. There's no problem with that whatsoever. And you don't have a problem with that either, since that's the same claim you're willing to accept. We don't know why Jerusalem was omitted. Anyway, let's continue.
But it isn't there. The physical home of God is not in the 5 books of Moses.
Yes, you keep saying that.
It's in many, many, many other biblical books.
Many biblical books set after it becomes an important place in the time of David,
That are written in the time when there is a physical temple.
and that are set in the time when there is a physical temple. You see, the setting of the story is a very important concern, which you are ignoring, I think. Maybe you've never read or written any fiction, but what is known, and to whom, and when it becomes known, is the most important aspect in dramatic composition. I think you do know this. The author of the Joseph story, for example, knows that Joseph ultimately becomes the vizier of Egypt, but the author does not betray his knowledge to the character of Joseph in the story or his family, because doing that would annihilate the entire story. If that information is out there in the story world at this time, for example, if an angel tells everyone that Joseph will rule Egypt, literally nothing else in the story will make any sense, not one thing. Authors of narrative works withhold information. However, authors can also drop hints to the reader that anticipate certain events through a technique called foreshadowing, and many of the biblical writers were masters, if not outright geniuses, with this technique. In the Joseph narrative, they use this technique in both large and small ways. For example, Joseph's dreams of the brothers' sheaves bowing to Joseph's sheaf is a bold one, but there's also subtle and not so subtle use of recurring phraseology, like the word lishalom that appears at the beginning and end of the story and only in the Joseph narrative, or the repeated use of the word matzah for discovery or revelation throughout the story, which even today readers find so delicious. The art to doing this is to drop hints to the reader without contaminating the storyline and without showing the author's hand. I assume you are aware of all this, but you're making it sound like you don't know how narrative works.
It isn't in the 5 books of Moses because that's not written at a time when there's a temple. That's the inescapable conclusion.
Nope, it's a very escapable conclusion. The books were either written by people for whom centralized worship was not the ideal, and who were not committed to Jerusalem, or it was written by people who were committed to the mythology of David as founder and sanctifier of Jerusalem and couldn't have its special identity being disclosed earlier in the narrative. And it's because these works were written around the time of the Babylonian exile that we don't see any evidence of a written Torah or adherence to Torah laws prior to that time. And like I said, there are 1,000 other more remote possibilities that are still infinitely more likely than divine authorship.
It's not in a time when there has to even be a temple, where Jerusalem even had to be the capital of the Jewish people.
Huh?
And so on. The 5 books of Moses from beginning to end are talking about 12 tribes.
Well, not the same tribes all the way through. Manasseh and Ephraim, or Manasseh and Ephraim, become first-class tribes in some texts. It's those kinds of shifts that tell you that you're looking at a composite work.
There's no hint that only the Judeans are going to survive.
Well, the Pentateuch does contain a number of indications that Judah is special, but if these works were written around the exile, I doubt people were feeling all that comfortable about their continued survival at that point. But again, These books are telling a story. Stories work by revealing specific information at specific times.
Any later author would have wanted to put that in and explain.
No, they wouldn't.
It would have Moses in his last blessings not to talk to all 12 tribes, but to call Judah in and say, you're going to be the guarantor of the nation, and you're going to be its great rulers, and you're going to be the...
But scholars view the blessing of Moses as being among the earliest texts in the Pentateuch and spliced in or edited at some much later point. But again, you seem to be unacquainted with the idea of narrative development, that events unfold in a certain sequence. Now, sequence is not necessarily the Bible's strong suit because there have been so many hands in it, but if you have a mythology of Judah rising to preeminence in congruence with the kingship of David and the establishment of Jerusalem, you can't have God decree that this should be so 400 years too soon. It breaks the story, which is something you don't seem to understand, but I think most people do. If you're writing a prequel to Star Wars, you're not going to have a scene where Darth Vader comes to parent-teacher night at Luke's school. That would render the existing mythology nonsensical. And if you have a belief and a mythology that Judah becomes great because of King David, you're not going to make Judah great before King David. You can hint at it, which the Bible does, but that's as far as you can go.
They're Judeans, right? They're having Judean monarchy. They're only tribe of Judah. Not a hint in the Torah that's going to be the case. And as I pointed out to you as well, the work of Benjamin Noonan in Loanwords, where you could tell the architecture, the moment in history of the Hebrew language, by which words have been assimilated by which cultures. But if it was post-exilic, you would definitely expect Aramaic words and Persian words and words that have come from the Babylonian exile.
Well, that's a fair point. But there are some loanwords from other languages, perhaps more than we can recognize. But here again, you've got naturalistic explanations in plenty. Perhaps scribes were extremely cautious about their vocabulary. Perhaps many of these stories were recited orally and didn't have loanwords that would have been unknown to the masses. The Book of Kings tells us that the people did not know Aramaic in the time of Hezekiah. They probably only knew Hebrew. Perhaps a racial purity evangelist like Ezra the scribe scrubbed any cultural contamination from his sources. There are many explanations that are infinitely better than a supernatural explanation. However unlikely these explanations might seem to you, they are infinitely more likely than the book being written by an entity that doesn't exist.
Tell Persia to come back with them. And there aren't any in the Torah. There are in the later biblical works, but this is not a post-exilic work.
Yes, it is. Not entirely, but large parts for sure.
This is from beginning to end. And then we went through detail after detail of stories that the author seems to know that cohere with much, much earlier times. You can see earlier videos for all that type of evidence.
Well, maybe I will.
And we looked at arguments that maybe was written later and claimed archaeological evidence for later authorship and explained why they don't seem to be correct. Again and again, everything's pointing to very, very, very ancient, to very early authorship.
Well, by everything pointing, I think you mean that the authors are pointing to early authorship. The authors want you to believe that this work is the work of Moses, and I don't think you're giving them enough credit for being able to pull this off. But there are many other indications that point to late authorship, and one of those things is the absence of any notion of a written Torah before the time of Josiah. You think the absence of the word Jerusalem is a problem? I think the absence of literary evidence for any such written work at all for 900 years after it was supposedly written is a far bigger problem. Anyway, only Deuteronomy actually claims to be significantly written by Moses, but that book is clearly framed by an author writing in a different time and place and voice. There are thousands of redundancies and contradictions betraying that the work we have is the product of many hands, and the tight correspondence of certain sections to 2 Kings, Jeremiah, and Lamentations gives us reasons to think that those sections were composed at around that time and perhaps by the same people. But I guess I'll have to watch your other videos to discover your evidence for early authorship.
But if it isn't late authorship, then its author knows about this remarkable history of its people, that they're going to be exiled like no other nation, hated and persecuted like crazy, shrunk in number when they're in exile, and yet, as the author seems to insist, not just in the book of the 5 books of Moses, but in other biblical books, have an incredible impact on the world. So whether it's Abraham being told, it's that through you will be blessed all the nations of the world, all the way through to whether it's Isaiah saying, you'll be a light unto the nations. And history, you'd think, if you're going to have this nation that's scattered and persecuted and hated and tiny in number, they're going to have a big impact or small impact. You'd expect almost no impact. The author of the biblical text thinks there's going to be a pretty big impact.
In some passages, yes.
And history says there has been a huge impact.
I agree, although the Christians and Muslims are responsible for most of that, and mostly responsible for persecution of the Jews over the ensuing centuries. So, if we're taking credit for Christian achievements, let's take credit for this masterpiece too, shall we?
Given birth to religions that have dominated the world, given birth to a whole new set of ideas and ideologies.
Maybe.
That have changed the world. Whether it was the insistence on a right to life in a time where Greeks and Romans and all civilizations thought population control can be done partly through killing children, for example, infanticide.
Well, you're getting off track. You are trying to demonstrate that human beings could not possibly have written the Bible. And that is exactly what you need to demonstrate, because your alternative is literally the impossible, that which cannot happen in the universe as we know it. So if you want to dismiss human authorship in favor of the impossible, you need to make the case that it would be impossible for humans to have written the Pentateuch, and you have not done that at all. I would consider it very possible that authors around the time of the Babylonian exile took existing oral traditions and wrote these works, setting them back in the time of Moses to give them authority. These authors were not perfect, but they were good at their craft, and in certain cases they may have been geniuses. They took measures to avoid undermining existing beliefs and exposing their pious fraud, and were reasonably but not totally successful with that. For every objection that you raise, you must show that it would be impossible to overcome that objection. Would it be impossible for authors to avoid mentioning Jerusalem? No, not impossible. Would it be impossible for authors to use a lexicon with fewer loanwords? No, not impossible. And if you have a possible account of the Bible in terms of human authorship, then you are done, and done. That is your explanation. You don't need imaginary beings, and you don't need to suspend the laws of the universe. You are done.
And ideas that spread to the world through Christianity or through Islam that no, you can't kill children to have population control. Ideas that you have to measure a society by how it cares for its weakest, which the 5 books of Moses and all the biblical books are full of.
Well, I'd say Deuteronomy is full of concern for weak members, although not full of solutions or legislation. Its concern for weak members of other nations is also notably lacking. But this is all irrelevant to biblical authorship, and it sounds like it should be in a different video.
That eventually transformed the world. That were not the way ancients, pre-biblical, and even post-biblical and European societies thought until the ideas spread. And idea after idea, whether it's the education of every child, which is a biblical idea.
I don't care. Irrelevant.
Whether it's that peace is an ideal and great warriorship and heroism and conquest is not an ideal.
I don't care. Irrelevant.
Alexander the Great being called great is an anti-biblical concept, or the Bible is against that. It wants, that there'll be no nation lifting up sword against nation, etc.
Nah, in Judges and Kings there is plenty of celebration of might and power, and God certainly celebrates his own might and power all the time, but this is irrelevant.
These ideas that transformed the world. So you got a nation that's persecuted, exiled, scattered, tiny in number, but going to be a light and giving light to the world. That sort of thing doesn't look like a human author.
Well, there's no other kind of author that we know of, so to me, it does look like a human author, or rather many authors. All the predictions you find in the Pentateuch of exile and restoration relate to the Babylonian exile. I wish you would have looked at some more specific examples, and we could see just how close the match is between the verses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and the circumstances of the Babylonian exile, and between these verses and the books of Jeremiah and Lamentations that describe the exile. All these predictions could easily have been composed around the time of the Babylonian exile by Israelite authors. Your ancestors. You should feel proud. They were, in many cases, quite brilliant, I think it's safe to say, but also human.
And that the author insists that whenever you go into exile and persecuted, but I won't abandon you, says God. I'm going to bring you back from your exile.
Well, God the character says that, but it was written by someone who perhaps had just himself returned from the exile.
Back to the land. Stuff that we're seeing in our own time.
It's not about our own time. It's about the Babylonian exile, which was 2,600 years ago, and that's very clear by comparing the language to Jeremiah and Lamentations.
That an ancient human author got that right in the 10th century BCE?
Nope. If they got it right between the 6th and 7th centuries BC, and probably even later.
Or does that start to look like, oh my goodness, this is being written by an author who knows the craziness of Jewish history?
Well, written by authors who probably knew the craziness of the Babylonian exile, that's exactly what it looks like.
Who knows that when the Jews mess up, they're going to be thrown into exile and have all this kind of stuff go on with them. And yet they're going to impact the world and come back to their land.
Yeah, somebody who came back to the land would know that they came back to the land. That's true.
And that all of that is written and predicted from the 10th century BC or any other time you pretty much want in the ancient world.
Well, it's predicted from when it was happening, so yes, fantastic writing, but not fantastic prediction.
That looks like a serious case for divine authorship of this text.
Nope, sorry. What it looks like is a serious case of people who were living at or around the Babylonian exile and understanding their experiences of victimization and abandonment through a covenantal framework that created sensibility and structure out of the chaos. They could write about these events because they were already happening. But the challenge was not to document the moment, but rather to make these horrific moments reasonable, comprehensible. And for that, they needed these events to have been anticipated, expected, justified. They needed these events to be the logical and inevitable consequences that flowed out of a broken covenant. And so that's how the experience of the Babylonian conquest was put into writing, as a matter of breach of loyalty of an ancient covenant and the imprecations that this automatically triggered. This is a reasonable naturalistic explanation that explains how the Pentateuch we have can claim to derive from the time of Moses and yet know about the events of the Babylonian exile. The idea of divine authorship, which invokes imaginary beings and violations of natural laws, is not even in the running as a possible explanation. And we need not even speak of the 1,000 other reasons why divine authorship of the Bible is absurd, such as the hundreds of contradictions and redundancies, promiscuous representations of the deity, appropriation of ancient Near Eastern writings and literary forms, moral erraticism, and frankly, everything on too human a scale to imagine it being the work of an entity who created a universe of 2 trillion galaxies. All we need to say is that it is possible that humans wrote this work. I'd say it's obvious, but we just need possible. Because the alternative is by definition impossible if the alternative is the supernatural. And that means that our conclusion is simply that people wrote this work.
And perhaps even stronger, when both in Leviticus and Deuteronomy very clearly the verses tell us that when you're out of the land's yield and agricultural productivity will drop, which it did.
Which it did when? Those verses, like all the others, are specifically referring to the Babylonian exile. If you are talking, for example, about a prediction of desolation, such as in Leviticus 26:33-35, you will find that 2 Chronicles 36:21 specifically connects the desolation wherein the land reclaims its Sabbaths to the Babylonian exile, whose duration was 70 years. Jeremiah 25:11 describes the land being a desolation for 70 years during the Babylonian exile, and describes this desolation at length in chapter 9. So Leviticus is a prediction of the Babylonian exile, but actually written at around that time.
Throughout history, the land was not able to support large populations of people. And yet when you come back to the land, it will suddenly become fruitful. And suddenly you'll be able to be more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. And of course, in Isaiah, you have this vision of trees coming up everywhere. And you take a look, I often show my children photos, pictures even under the British Mandate of the land in the early 20th century, when you can look at what's today the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway and see a desert. And today you drive on the same route and it's become this incredible fruitful land.
Which is very inspiring, but entirely irrelevant since Leviticus and Deuteronomy are describing events that happened 2,600 years ago. And if you're referring to Isaiah 41:18-19, which is actually 2nd Isaiah writing after the exile, look at the framing for that chapter. Verse 2, who has roused a victor from the east. This is pretty obviously a reference to Cyrus of Persia, who defeated the Babylonians and permitted the exiled Israelites to return to their homeland. So once again, this is all about the Babylonian exile and has nothing to do with your kids or highways in Tel Aviv or whatever you're talking about.
Able to support massive population, millions and millions of Jews and Palestinians and in this land, right? Exactly as the Bible says, that when you come back to the land, trees will be there all over the place and forest yield and agricultural yield. And you start to think, this is a human getting this right thousands of years ago?
Yes, it's a human getting this right thousands of years ago because it's all happening thousands of years ago. I mean, how on earth do you read these verses? God is saying what? I summoned Cyrus to destroy my enemies, and now you, Israel, who I drew from the ends of the earth, don't be afraid, because I will turn deserts into ponds and plant cedars and cypresses and elms 2,500 years in the future, so that everyone will know what God has done? Does that make the slightest bit of sense to you? I don't know. You're a Kirov professional, so maybe it does at this point.
Or are we looking at an author who knows history?
Yes, it was mostly history at the time these authors were writing about these things.
Can make history happen.
Yes, people can make history happen. That's what history is.
The author the Bible seems to claim for itself, which is the divine author.
Interesting. I can only think of a couple instances where God is claimed by the Bible to actually write anything. Most of the Bible makes no authorship claims.
And this book that has impacted the world more than any other.
Oh, is it going to be a popularity contest then? You know we Jews are going to lose that one, right?
This book that is believed in to be divine more than any other might in fact be a divine book. That's clearly a radical idea in that it's unpopular in today's world.
I can't imagine why.
But unpopular ideas can nevertheless be true ideas. At the very least, I hope this series and this video has given something to think about. And for those who are adherents to faith or thinking deeply about the Torah as a source of wisdom for them, something to really give pause to think maybe there really is something so special and divine in the way we live when we try to live up to its values.
Well, you seem like a lovely fellow, and you did give me something to think about, and I'm talking about the relative lack of loanwords in the Pentateuch, but I'm not any closer to thinking the Torah is divinely authored. When I read the Bible, which I do very frequently, it just screams multiple human authorship to me. It's the only way to make sense of the jarring changes in style, language, point of view, implied knowledge, and so on. Nothing about it strikes me as the sort of thing a perfect being would write if such a being existed. But here you were just taking on a much narrower question and just asking if humans could possibly have written the Pentateuch. Because if they could have, then they could have written it at such a time as to make all those prophecies unimpressive. And I think the answer is very much yes. It is possible for humans to have written the Pentateuch. Very possible. There is no objection that shows it to be impossible. And therefore, this is your explanation for the Pentateuch. End of story. Now you can proceed from there to ask who exactly these people were, but that's a different video. But just to wrap up, here's what I find odd about this video. You start off by saying that the divinity of the Pentateuch is demonstrated by its prophecies. Humans could not have written this work, you say, because they could have not have predicted all these things correctly. Such future knowledge would not just be unlikely. If it's just unlikely, we could say, hey, what a lucky guess, and that's going to be our best explanation. Lucky guess. But no, you're saying that having such precise future knowledge would violate natural law. It would literally be impossible for a human being to know these things. So you seem to consider violation of natural law to be a disqualifier for any explanation. We cannot imagine human beings having precise future knowledge because this is a violation of nature. And if that's the case, I don't see how you can even suggest divine authorship to start with. If you're disqualifying explanations that involve human beings having capabilities not known in the natural world, you have to disqualify explanations having other beings or powers that are not known in the natural world. Isn't that right? So I don't understand how you get off the ground here. But let's forget about that. Let's say that the prophecies are such that no human could possibly have made those prophecies. No human could possibly have written this work. Well, That would be a very strong argument. If it's literally impossible for humans to have done something, then you have to look for alternative explanations. That is a very powerful argument. It is impossible for humans to have created the Andromeda Galaxy. You have to look for other explanations. If you show that it's impossible for humans to have done something, that is the strongest argument that they did not do that something. But that's not the argument you make in your video. The argument you make to disqualify human authorship actually has nothing to do with prophecies, nothing to do with impossible knowledge, nothing to do with violation of natural law. Your argument is just that human authors could not have written a book set in an earlier period without betraying their own cultural context. Nothing about impossible knowledge or violation of nature. And so, I'm going to call this bait and switch. You claim to be demonstrating the divinity of the Bible based on its possession of impossible knowledge. A very strong case. But your argument is just that it's unlikely for human beings to write this kind of book. A book without the term Jerusalem, or without certain loanwords, or whatever. That's a very weak case. So if you wanted to be honest about this, you should have said at the outset that your proof for the divinity of the Bible is that it has features that are unexpected or unlikely from authors writing in a particular era, because that is your entire case. But here's what I think. I think you recognize that that sounds weak, because even if there are some unlikely aspects to human authorship of the Bible, there's no reason to rule it out in favor of the supernatural and impossible. So you wanted to wrap the sheep of a weak argument in the wolf's clothing of prophecy and impossible knowledge. You want people to come away from your video thinking that humans could not possibly have written the Bible because it contains impossible knowledge. But all you even tried to show is that the book is different than what you would expect a 7th century author to write. And even that's very debatable. So, I think you're trying to con your viewers. You want them to think they got a Hattori Hanzo sword, but all they really got was a plastic spoon, and that's not fair.